Thanks so much. Those were both fantastic talks, and I'm really pleased to be here at this initial panel of this Blue Humanities Keywords project at University of South Florida. I'm really excited to come to the conversation part where we can talk about relationships between Blue Humanities' understanding of the non-human creatures with whom we share our waters, and also these larger human questions around migration. It's actually a kind of nice setup because my talk is really going to be much more focused on the individual level as opposed to the collective. And I am talking primarily about humans in this talk. But anyway, I'll get right to it. Then we can move on to Q&A in a minute. So my keyword is buoyancy. This force refers to the physical force that keeps a body afloat in a fluid. I'm thinking specifically today, as I'll explain in a few minutes, about a human body and a large body of liquid water. The ocean is always good to think with, and I will come back to the ocean. But the example I'll start with today will be an outdoor pool about a mile from my house on the coast of central Connecticut. Right now, by the way, that pool is drained because it is way too cold to have water in a concrete pool, and the coastline near it is frozen solid, 100 yards offshore. So my talk today will feature a personal anecdote and a canonical literary example. But before I get to the fun parts, I want to wrestle a little bit with some of the physical and theoretical implications of my thinking around buoyancy. Buoyancy is a force that a fluid exerts on an object that is partly or fully immersed in it. The body of the fluid pushes the immersed body up against the direction of gravity. Archimedes famously shouted "Eureka" when his bath started to overflow because he realized that the amount of water displaced by a submerged object, in his case, his own body in the bath, and it'll be a human body in the example I'll get to in a minute, that displacement of water measures the buoyant force exerted on that object. The greater a volume of water that you displace, the greater the force, which is why even very large and heavy objects, think container ships or blue whales, can float if they displace enough water to support them. An object as heavy as a whale or a ship would sink if it displaced less volume and thus created less buoyant force. The Blue Humanities explores relationships between humans and water. Buoyancy names a physical force, and perhaps also a metaphorical force, that water exerts upon submerged bodies. The key theoretical point here is that the force is exerted by water. Water is the agent. The human body is the subject of its agency, the recipient of its force. Too often in our Anthropocene age, in which humans raise forests and penetrate seafloors, we can forget the basic facts of human vulnerability in an aqueous environment. One of the important results of Blue Humanities thinking, it seems to me, is a reminder of our own incapacity in an alien environment. Human bodies float, mostly, for a little while, if we are careful and keep our lungs full of air. The balance of forces in a floating body, the displacement of water by a wide open chest full of air, and the pressure of water underneath that body, puts a floating body into a temporary equipoise. That balance depends on the nature and movements of the human body, as we'll see in my anecdote. It also depends on a careful, quiet collaboration between the force of the water beneath and the easy motions of a body floating on the surface. The position I'm talking about, in which a body floats on its back, chest inflated with air, head tilted back but not submerged, is pretty stable, at least until a wave comes, or until a body gets cold, or until panic ensues. The balance lasts for a limited time, maybe a few minutes, maybe half an hour, maybe half an afternoon, if you're lucky until the Coast Guard comes. It depends on lots of things, especially temperature and the stillness of the body. During that time, the human body and the water body partially unify themselves. It doesn't last, but it's a meaningful moment. Humans float in water, sometimes, for a time. Now I'll get to my anecdote, which takes us back maybe 15 or almost 20 years. We're near my home on the Connecticut shoreline. 2 or 3 days a week during this particular summer, I brought my then young kids to their learn to swim class in an outdoor pool managed by the YMCA. Each time we got there, there was an adult man who was taking a private lesson amid the toddlers. He was in his late 30s, rail thin, quite muscular. In my best chatting with other grown-ups while at a kids event voice, I asked him what he was up to. What are you here for? I can't swim, he mumbled, looking away, embarrassed. I never learned. At the start of that day's lesson, he sat down at the side of the pool in the deep end and slowly lowered himself into the water, visibly terrified, clutching the side, listening to his teacher. She let him hold on for a minute and then asked him to test what would happen if he let go. He opened his hands, raised his arms up above his head, and sank like the proverbial stone. She grabbed his arms and pulled him up to the surface. It was the start of a long, tense, sometimes frightening summer of lessons. He came back every day during the weeks of my kids' lessons. I learned a little more about him, though I'm sorry to say that I don't remember his name. He'd fallen into a pool in a backyard party as a child and had nearly drowned. At that time, he was roughly the same age as my kids were at this summer, but he never had a swim lesson. After that day as a child, he'd been terrified of the water, and he'd taken steps throughout his life to avoid being close to water. Finally, decades later, he'd gotten up the courage to test his own buoyancy. It was a deeply impressive, repeated act of courage and will. An adult among children, he came back day by day and week by week. He learned eventually to relax his body, to spread his arms wide, to angle his chest up toward the surface, to inflate his lungs, and to scull gently with his arms. He was never going to be very buoyant, but by the time my kids could dog paddle their ways across the pool, he could too. He could also float on his back, maybe for about 10 seconds at a time. Buoyancy, it turned out, was something even an adult could learn. I think about this anecdote a lot for what it says about buoyancy and what it says about education. Sometimes you need bravery to learn things. It's also possible, through practice and courage, to change your relationship with water. When I think about that man's summer of swim lessons, I am always inspired. Now I'm going to turn to my literary example, which I suspect maybe a few in the audience have already guessed. It features another frightened swimmer from the Nutmeg State of Connecticut, the cabin boy Pip in Melville's Moby-Dick. Pip is a native of Tolland County in the northern part of Connecticut, where UConn's main campus sits today near the border with Massachusetts. Pip is one of many 19th century mariners who sailed the wide oceans without being much of a swimmer. When he's more or less accidentally, left behind by his whaleboat and believes himself to be lost in the middle of the ocean, Pip floats for a little while, though he knows he cannot float for very long. His vision of the waters includes a glimpse of divine transcendence, as well as perhaps the most gorgeous prose in a novel full of gorgeous prose. And I have a fairly long quotation from Melville here. Pip saw the multitudinous God omnipresent coral insects that out of the firmament of waters heaved the colossal orbs. He saw God's footprint on the treadle of the loom and spoke it, and therefore his shipmates called him mad. So man's humanity is heaven's sense, and wandering from all mortal reason, man comes at last to that celestial thought, which, to reason, is absurd and frantic. And Wheeler Woe feels then uncompromised, indifferent as his God. Pip's situation was in some ways like that of the man in the YMCA pool. Pip did not volunteer for his swimming lesson, but he too struggled to find buoyancy. In Melville's lyrical prose, the result of the mismatch between human body and water body is madness, but madness of a particular kind, heaven's sense. There is an epic oceanic knowledge to which Pip, as much as any other character in Moby-Dick, gains visionary access. Ahab in his rage, Ishmael in his reveries, and Queequeg when swimming or throwing his harpoon get close to this kind of physical intimacy with the oceanic. But only Pip gets the whole truth, swirling over him, God's wet footprint, the multitudinous voices of coral insects, frantic absurdity, and at last an inhuman indifference. The water that buoys us up does not love us, even if we are often tempted to love it. Pip gets rescued by merest chance, so his buoyancy does last long enough to preserve his body, if not his mind. These two floating figures, the man learning painfully how to support himself on the water, and the boy abandoned by the deep ocean's endless underneathness, demonstrate how physics frames the relationship between humans and bodies of water. We displace water, and it buoys us up for a time. In that dance of buoyancy, two bodies push against each other, and if we do it right, they remain briefly in balance. For several years, I've been using Melville's tag, a two-stranded lesson, to describe the blue humanities. That phrase, which appears in Father Mapple's sermon about Jonah early in the novel, has become my favorite way to capture the duality of water. We love it, but it threatens us. It's intimate to our environments and our bodies, but it remains alien and often inimical to our living. We need water, but not too much and not for too long. Buoyancy names a temporary balance between forces and bodies, a physical relationship between the complex water-infused systems that make up a human and the complex water-driven systems that flow through our environment. It's a good thing to practice and a good thing to think with. Thank you.